My name is Alex Warth, and this is Ambsheet, a new kind of spreadsheet for exploring scenarios. This is joint work with Geoffrey Litt and Bryant at Ink and Switch. Okay, so people use spreadsheets to think through financial models, budgets, and any situation that involves considering lots of possible scenarios. Spreadsheets answer what-if questions without forcing us to recalculate everything by hand. You just make a change and then see the effects. But, as you're about to see, exploring the space of possibilities using a traditional spreadsheet kind of sucks. It can take a lot of work. In our Ambsheet project, we're experimenting with a small extension that goes a long way. Here's the idea. What if a single spreadsheet cell could hold multiple values at once? I'll let Geoffrey explain.
So I have a simple monthly budgeting spreadsheet here where I have a monthly price I'm paying for my car, my apartment, and my Netflix bill. And then I have a total cell where I'm summing them up. Very straightforward. But now let's consider, what if we wanted to compare two different cars that we're thinking of purchasing? How might you go about that in a typical spreadsheet? Well, one thing you can do is change this number back and forth. So I could say 1200, look at this, but now I have to remember, wait, what was the other original price again? So I can change it back and forth and so on. We call this toggling. It's very convenient, but it's unfortunate that you can't compare all the possibilities side by side. Now, another thing I could do is start restructuring my spreadsheet. So I can make a new column next to this one where I'm going to replace the 500 with a 1200, and I'll redo my formula here as well. And now we can see both of the prices, so that's great. However, there are other drawbacks to this approach. When you get to larger sheets, it can become quite cumbersome to do this kind of restructuring of adding new parts of your sheet. And this doesn't scale very well, because imagine now if we wanted to consider two possible apartments, we would need to manually add two more columns here, and there's a lot of manual work involved with that. Let's do it a different way. In Ambsheet, we ask the question, what if you could just tell the spreadsheet that in a single cell you're considering multiple values? And if you could directly communicate that, then the spreadsheet could help you think through the possibilities. And in Ambsheet, you can do exactly that. So I'm going to replace this 500 with this syntax, 500, comma 1200 in curly braces. And what that does is now you can see this cell contains either 500 or 1200. We call this an amb value. And that name comes from the amb construct in the non-deterministic evaluator in the SICP textbook. And you'll see another thing, which is that these cells remain the same, but the total cell also has two possible values. And that makes sense because we're now looking at two possible cars, so there's two possible totals. If I'd like to, it's pretty obvious in this case, but I can click on the totals and see which of these totals corresponds to which of the cars that we might buy. Now, we can also add new amb dimensions beyond this first amb dimension that we added. So if I change this apartment to also be an amb value, now we have two possible apartments and four possible totals. And in fact, if we look at this sidebar, which shows details of the selected cell, we have a nice table here that shows us very clearly what's going on. We have two dimensions of amb values, the car and the apartment, and we have four possible values displayed in this 2x2 matrix. And we can clearly see what the four possibilities are and where they came from. So that's the basics of amb values. But as you start getting to these sort of multidimensional spaces of scenarios, it's very natural to ask, how can we actually explore and make sense of these scenarios? And that's where filters come in. I've already shown you a very basic version of filtering, where if I click on this car 500, I can see throughout the sheet, these are the two totals that correspond to that possibility, and these other ones are grayed out. So that is a kind of filtering. And you'll see we have a filter sidebar here where I can do the same thing, across multiple cells, and I can filter down my total that way. Where filters get really interesting, though, is that you can also filter on formula outputs. So let me show an example of that. Let's say we have a number we don't want to go over for our monthly budget, cash on hand. I'm going to say it's 4,200. And we can write a formula called can afford, where we compute, is the total under our cash on hand? It's very simple. B7 is our total, and that has to be less than B9. Now note when I write these formulas, they're just normal spreadsheet formulas. I'm not thinking about and values at all. The spreadsheet takes care of propagating these multiple possibilities through our formulas for us. I'll hit enter there, and now I get 4 Boolean values corresponding to these 4 totals being affordable or not. Now as a last step, I can set a filter on this output cell, filter to true. And what that does is, as you'll see in this total cell, we've now filtered out, we've grayed out the totals that we cannot afford. Furthermore, it kept propagating back through the computation, and we see this $3,700 apartment's grayed out. And that means there's no world in which we can afford this apartment. There's no total we can afford that includes this apartment as part of it. So you can see here how we can filter not just on inputs, but also on outputs. And that's actually a very powerful construct that helps you explore large groups of scenarios. All right, and that's the basics of Ambsheet.
Geoffrey's example looked simple, but there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. Like he said, each am value is a dimension in the possibility space. In his example, he had 2 am values, one for the car and one for the apartment. The Ambsheet computes the Cartesian product of those am values to generate every possible scenario. Then it evaluates the formulas in each scenario. Note that the formulas never see am values. They operate on the same plain old values that we see in Google Sheets and Excel. And so the formula language can stay the same. All right, I'm going to be Geoffrey's hype man for a minute. Did you see that he filtered on the output of a formula to inform his choice of car and apartment? How cool is that? He's querying the possibility space to make decisions about each amb that lead to happy outcomes. So far, we've only used AMs to model choices. In other words, things we control, like which car should I lease or which apartment should I rent. But we can also use AMs to model unknowns, like the weather next month or how many guests will actually come to your wedding. In fact, in the paper we have a nice case study about an AM sheet that Geoffrey created to plan his wedding. On that note, you can think of an AM value as a collection of possible values. So far, we haven't had any duplicates, but if we were to allow duplicates, then we could represent arbitrary distributions. For example, the ambiliteral heads, heads, tails represents a loaded coin in which heads is twice as likely as tails. This enables a naive form of probabilistic programming in AM sheets. To play with this idea, we added specialized syntax for common types of distribution. For example, this one here means create an AM value with 100 samples from a normal distribution with a mean of 70 and a standard deviation of 5. This is the very expression that Geoffrey used in his wedding planning Ambsheet. What you saw in this video is only one of several versions of Ambsheets. That's all we had time for. But we've experimented with different semantics, form factors, and applications. Please check out our paper for more info. Thanks for watching.